Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast. I'm your host, John Slick Baum. Here on the Aerospace Advantage podcast, we speak with leaders in the DoD, industry, and subject matter experts to explore the intersection between strategy, operational concepts, technology, and policy when it comes to air and space power. So, if you like learning about aerospace power, you are in the right place. To our regular listeners, thank you so much for coming back, and if it's your first time here, we really appreciate you joining us. Now, we're here to talk about an incredibly serious topic: combat search and rescue, or CSAR for short. Bottom line, when aircrews strap into their jets and fly into harm's way, they face a very real chance of getting shot down, having to eject, and finding themselves deep behind enemy lines with nothing but some basics in their survival vests, a sidearm, and their training. They may be injured or face incredibly hostile physical conditions. Odds are the enemy also knows that they are down there and will be doing everything possible to capture them. And I want to tell you, as a combat pilot, we all know these risks. None of us want it to be us, but we know the odds are that someone might not make it back from a mission. To put you in the mindset and give you some insight of what this means, let's put you into a flight of F-4s over North Vietnam on August 19th, 1972. What you're going to hear is an actual shoot down, ejection, and the aftermath.
Last three got it tally, take it down, take it down. Take it down, take it down. Pull up now. Okay. Oh, shit. Dash two's hit. All right, pull up.
And that's it. You just heard it. What no airman ever wants to experience. Tail number 69-0355 is headed down in a ball of flames after a surface-to-air missile hit it. Two airmen just seconds before were focused on their mission in one of the most sophisticated jets of the era, and now they're fighting for their lives.
Pull out. That's one hot guard. Mayday. That's two, just been shot down.
From this point forward, it's all about figuring out the status of the aircrew. Did they successfully eject? Did the parachutes open? Where are they going down?
Okay, gotta shoot. Load up. It's 9 o'clock. Okay. Don't stand just yet. Okay, I'm working its position again. 21.1 and shoot 32. Any other shoot? Negative. Got the fire down there. We're gonna shoot at 9 o'clock, Mike. Okay, let's check the area he's gonna land in. Okay, we'll have to come back hard left.
Hear that emergency locator beacon go off? That means someone got out. Tragically, in this shootdown, there was only one survivor.
Roger. People, come up, boys. Dodge 1 Alpha, or Dodge 2 Alpha, or 2 Bravo? Roger, copy. Are you okay? Say again? Good. Didn't see him shoot.
That was the Wizzo, who's deep in enemy territory now. He has no idea his pilot just died, and his one connection to the outside world and his survival is his emergency radio. His world has forever changed. Dodge 1. And there you go, the key question. Can you get me out? He knows he has one ticket to avoid capture. The airmen of combat search and rescue, who are specifically trained and equipped to fly into the heart of the threat, find the downed airmen, extract them, and get them back to friendly lines. Failing rescue, the airmen will fall into enemy hands, face high odds of torture, and possibly death. For those that fly, we know this. As Air Force airmen, this is an occupational hazard. We know it's part of serving to fly, fight, and win for our nation. So that's the brief introduction to our episode. We're going to learn about the airmen who have one of the toughest jobs in the service. And just to be clear, this isn't just a mission, it's a moral imperative. CSAR airmen have been run hard over the past 3 decades supporting combat operations in Desert Storm, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and other places around the world. They're also at an inflection point regarding what their mission will look like in the future as they look to fly against peer threats in the Pacific and Europe. Okay, so to better help us understand this mission, we've got Colonel Russ Cook, who commands the 23rd Wing, one of the key organizations responsible for the CSAR mission in the Air Force. So, sir, thanks so much for being here today.
It's great being here. Thanks for having me.
Well, sir, if I can just get us started, we just walked folks through a macro element of the CSAR world, but you're really the expert here. So can you help the audience understand what the CSAR mission looks like today and what the various components are of the mission? Of course, we think about the helicopter, but there's a lot of other assets that are involved.
Yeah, the central element of combat search and rescue has not changed, and that's an American moral imperative of no one left behind, and then the motto of combat rescue, these things we do that others may live. What it looks like when you talk about dedicated combat search and rescue assets, it's three primary assets. Going from the highest altitude asset to the lowest altitude asset, I'll start with the HC-130J. That's a C-130 that's specifically built and trained, organized, and equipped to conduct combat search and rescue. It can do aerial insertion of pararescue. It can do long-range delivery of any requirements that are needed to support isolated personnel. It refuels our helicopters as they move out and also provides tactical command and control of combat search and rescue forces. Then the H860, which is the kind of what you usually see with the helicopter, that is the primary recovery vehicle for Air Force. And with that vehicle, we're right now transitioning from the H860G to H860 Whiskey. But that aircraft and those crews are trained for long-range personal recovery through aerial refueling with HC-130 and delivering the pararescue force. And that's the last of the three-part triad. The pararescue team, there's similarities to what you've seen in Vietnam and what was discussed, but that team's developed quite a bit. So it's usually a six-person team that goes in, three on each helicopter, or a six-person team that jumps in with the HC-130. And there are surface assets, whether it's maritime or land, and they can do short-range immediate recovery operations. They can do long-term operations, and they also provide medical care and support for the isolated personnel. And those three are dedicated assets. And then after that, you have a whole litany of additional forces, whether it's strike assets, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, command and control, a lot of other platforms that help get that mission to happen, since it's such a complex and difficult mission.
Well, no, I really appreciate it. And you started to touch on talking about the airmen. So can you talk about who the key players are? And, you mentioned some of them, but really love to hear your perspective on, the PJs, the Crows, and the other actors that are in the mix.
Yeah, it's a large team and a mix of operations and maintenance and officers and enlisted. I think what you see the most is your pilots and your pararescues, and certainly they're a critical component of it. But in the HC-130J, you also have the combat systems officer. That's a airman who's specifically trained to deliver combat search and rescue capability, command and control, and also perform a whole litany of assets requirements. In the back of the HC-130, you also have career enlisted aviators, the load master who can deliver equipment or deliver personnel to a specific spot and location. In the back of the H860s, you have career enlisted aviators, and there are special mission aviators that are in charge of the weapons and delivering firepower if needed. They also do the hoist and do all kinds of delivery and take care of the aircraft, make sure the aircraft's ready to perform. And then our maintenance and support teams are very, very unique teams. They are specially trained to operate in austere environments, to operate very forward, to operate in locations that the Air Force doesn't typically operate in. And they are highly skilled at keeping these weapon systems going, and they are just as much important to the mission. And they bleed green, as we say, in combat rescue, just like everyone else, just as importantly as they do.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much for shedding light on all of the players that make the mission possible. Really wondering if you can explain to everybody and talk to us about how the CSAR mission is integrated as part of the Air Tasking Order, or the ATO, during combat missions. And for the audience that don't understand this, the Air Tasking Order is essentially the master plan of how an air campaign runs on any given day, and it's the guide of who's doing what and when. So that would be a great understanding for us.
Yeah, so one of the key elements I'll say right up is the Air Tasking Order is probably not going to happen without combat rescue forces in place. So nobody flies unless you have someone that can recover personnel if we need to. So no CSAR, no ATO, and we saw that in Afghanistan, and we've seen that in numerous operations in the last 50 years, where those rescue forces have to be there first to execute the ATO. Now, once you're doing a master attack plan and you have an ATO built, what we usually use our dedicated rescue forces is we put them as far forward and as close to the highest risk missions as possible. So where do we think we could lose an asset? Where do we think we're going to need that very special dedicated capability? And that's where our teams plan to. They plan to train to be able to go and operate in that location. And then for the rest of the needs, there's never enough rescue assets. For the rest of the needs of the ATO, we look for other joint capabilities or partner capabilities to kind of cover that full spectrum. But with the ATO, from that, we define where the risk is, and we put our combat rescue forces as close to that area as possible.
Well, sir, it looks like the A10 will be around for a while, and traditionally they maintain the cadre of the Sandy pilots, and those are the ones who are qualified to be, the specific on-scene commanders during a search and rescue. How are they factored into your CSAR rescue concepts of operations?
Yeah, it looks like the A10 will be around longer than the F-22 right now as the NGAD comes online. So that aircraft's still in the fight for a long time. What I will say is the A10 and Sandy, we talk about dedicated rescue assets with the HC-130, H860 and pararescue. The Sandy is a dedicated airman that's focused and trained to do that Sandy mission, that CSAR role. And it's the only fighter asset that we have that does that role, which ensures that we locate the survivor, support the recovery assets. If you're a survivor on the ground and you got a Sandy overhead, the likelihood that you're being recovered just went up tenfold. It is a big difference having that Sandy teammate out there, and there's no number two. A-10s are number one when it comes to fighter and CSAR, and there's just no number two in the Air Force right now. And you have to look to joint forces such as tactical recovery of aircrew and personnel and Marine Corps to see another fighter capability that can do that. So their capabilities are without peer in the Air Force, and it is an extreme change. And I'll tell you, when I'm flying, I'm much happier when I've got an A10 overhead.
Yeah, sure. And, just talking about it quickly, I flew the F-16 when we had the Sandy roll and was fortunate to go through the majority of the upgrade before they took it off our doc statement. So having some understanding of that, obviously the A10 is masterfully crafted to do that job. But can you explain how you saw the mission evolve over the past 2 decades in Iraq and Afghanistan? I mean, obviously a bit of a change from the traditional mindset when we go back, and you mentioned, in our focus of Vietnam and things like that. How did the unique environments impact your TTPs or tactic techniques and procedures?
Yeah, like the rest of the Department of Defense, we completely pivoted to conduct operations to support and counter violent extremist organizations. Each of the 3 weapon systems kind of went through a different metamorphosis, but they all 3 changed in pretty unique ways. As a whole, what we found ourselves doing is a lot more joint taskings away from your traditional recovery of a down fighter pilot that the combat search and rescue community was really built to do. If you're talking about in Iraq, we were doing a lot of special operations support and providing combat search and rescue for those missions, since they found themselves overtasked to do, especially during the McChrystal days when they were doing so many hits a night, they needed support. And that's where I cut my teeth in combat rescue, starting out mostly supporting special operations forces. From that kind of high-end mission all the way to your everyday mission. In Afghanistan, especially when we were trying to cover a large area of operations and provide golden hour recovery, that is recovery within the first hour of incident or injury, we found that one of the best places to push was combat search and rescue forces forward for them to do that recovery. The end result of that is our helicopter forces and our pararescue forces became very, very good at terminal area tactics, or that is the tactics right at the landing zone, right when you're going into the fight. And so the transition we saw with the helicopters is a transition from a force that only used weapons employment to defend themselves in a very rare incident to more of an offensive active role and how they mitigate the risk in the terminal area so they can actually get in and get the survivor out. And that's going to carry on quite a ways. With our pararescue team, we solidified that 6-person team and how their tactics and operate. And they can do surface operations for extended periods of time. If you go back to Vietnam, you had 1, maybe 2 pararescuemen on an aircraft. Now with the 6-man team, they provide a little bit more combat capability. We also added the combat rescue officer over the last 20 years, which gives them a leader who can do the up and out integration with other fighter assets once they do get on the ground. And then the HC-130 as well, they started doing their own recovery and using the HC-130 as a recovery vehicle, going into austere locations that previously you wouldn't have expected to see an HC-130 go into. They also did a lot of combat delivery missions with pararescue personnel and started developing those tactics. And what's most interesting, I think probably the greatest development I've seen over the last 5 years in that community is their tactical command and control. As we ran out of assets that could provide C2, they start taking an increasing role in command and control and being a increased leader in the actual recovery, depending on what assets were available and who could be supporting fires. And so those 20 years of combat provided a very unique and I would say a very structured approach to how we tackled those problem sets. But they were all tactics and techniques that developed a community in combat that's going to be very useful for us in the future. And that experience is invaluable.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, just watching, for me, going back to my early enlisted days, showing up in Iceland, working with the 56 Rescue Squadron is my background. And, those folks would spend more time rescuing Icelandic fishermen out of the ocean than obviously F-15 pilots, right? But that was more seen as more of a one-off, and obviously the all the personnel have the skills to do those types of things. But we've watched our traditional CSAR assets doing over the last 20 years is just absolutely incredible. And instead of just being on alert all the time, waiting for a fighter to get shot down, now they're doing the JOB every single day, probably 20-fold than what they would have seen in a more traditional role. And so because of all of that, where would you assess the wear and tear, after essentially 3 decades of nonstop use, having that on your equipment and personnel? I mean, it obviously had to take a huge toll.
Yeah, the equipment side's pretty easy, as you'd expect. You just flew more hours than we expected to fly in those airplanes. So we replaced the HC-130Ps with HC-130Js in the last 7 years. We have a whole new fleet of HC-130s, and we're transitioning from the H860G to H860 Whiskey. Just had to get new aircraft. Those aircraft are done, and we weren't getting the mission capable rates that we needed to be able to continue to do the mission looking forward. And with that, we got some increased digital integration, some value in that upgrade. But that was the key piece. And really, that one's probably pretty obvious. The tough piece is the personnel side. And what does that do? The toll on the families was tremendous, as it was across the Department of Defense through the last 20 years. We lost a lot of talent, as the Department of Defense lost in a lot of places. And so coming out of that, what we have is a lot of commanders and leaders and senior NCOs with experience on that. And so looking forward, they are very dedicated to protecting our forces, fencing our forces, understanding the family life and the difference between a surge and day-to-day operations. We've put additional resources into both the physical through various programs that we have in the units now, so physical development and physical recovery programs from folks who get injured. The mental side as well, we have mental health professionals in almost all of our rescue units that help give that day-to-day check up and check in and get eyes on folks and see how they're doing and kind of break down some of the stigma with mental health. And then spiritual, we've started integrating chaplains into rescue forces at the unit level. And when you want an impact, and rescue is such a tight-knit community, and it's hard to break into that community. You can't just visit on a Thursday and expect folks to talk to you. You have to be in that squadron every day. You have to see what they're going through. You have to know them by first name or call sign. And by putting those professionals in there, I think we have found a way to help keep our community as healthy as possible under the situation. We still have places to improve. So that's the negative of it. The positive of it is the combat experience. As we look to the future and how do we tackle problems, there is a combat experience that is, you just can't quantify the value of what that is when you place it against problems. And so that element of it has been extremely helpful, and it's showing as we have just the most combat experienced leaders since Vietnam. And how much they've been doing. And for me, I was in pilot training when September 11th happened. Almost every wing commander across the Air Force right now has spent their whole career in the last 20 years in combat. And so that's going to pay off dividends to us as leaders, but we have to keep taking care of the family, and we have to take the lessons learned and the talent loss we had in the last 20 years and move forward with a position that protects our airmen a little better.
Yeah, you really struck a chord with me, with that quick reminiscence of being in pilot training during 9/11 and really honing the point that there are airmen like yourselves that have served their entire time in a time of war, an entire 20-plus year career at war. So obviously it's going to take the wear and tear, and you guys are doing a great job taking care of the airmen by the changes that you've integrated into the squadron. But that experience is really the part that we can't lose. And hopefully we can take that experience and think towards the future with everything that we have going on in the world right now. And as you're looking at operating environments that'll likely see peer competitors in Europe and the Pacific, I imagine it's going to have a major impact on your CSAR mission. So how do you think you'll see this impact, again, the TTPs from a macro and an unclassified vantage point?
We typically say European and Indo-PACOM theater or European and Pacific theater. They're two very different theaters. The Pacific one is, the area of operations is just, it's half a globe. It just doesn't get much bigger than that. The European one is big in itself, and it's pretty big too. Both have peer adversaries in them, and the Pacific has both our primary peer adversaries and some of the additionals as well. They both have very different partners across those theaters. We have our NATO allies in Europe, and we have our allies in the Pacific who are not as unaligned in a similar way as NATO. So they are two very different problem sets, but what they do have in common is strategic competitors who come out with a lot of capability in large areas of operations against a dedicated force that's not that big. It can't cover either of those area of operations by ourselves. And so as we continue to develop our TTPs on how that dedicated force goes out and conducts combat search and rescue in those high risk areas that we talked about with the ATO, what is the highest risk area? I need to make sure dedicated forces are available there. I think one of the key elements in development for personal recovery and combat rescue is going to be with our joint and our partner nations to create combat capability for them to conduct combat search and rescue throughout the other areas that we can't cover. And those tactics, techniques, and procedures are going to be just as critical as the weapon systems. And the other area that we have to develop a little bit better is the isolated personnel, whether it's a pilot or some other person. If they're down outside of our recovery area, how do we make sure that they're able to survive and continue to maneuver safely until we can get to recover them? So it's going to drive our TTPs in different ways. We look towards peer competitors again, since we've been not looking at that way for a while. It's going to require us to work with our joint partners better and our partner nations too, who have their own capabilities. And then how do we take some of our capacity, for instance, with the Guardian Angels, and attach them to partner nations so I can create a capacity for combat search and rescue? And then the isolated personnel, we have to develop better procedures, better supporting assets, better supporting systems for them so that they can survive over a 24, 48, 72-hour period in these locations.
Yeah, absolutely. It all makes a heck of a lot of sense. And I want to, think through lessons learned from places like Vietnam coming back into the fold. I mean, we're talking about situations in the future where CSAR crews are going to be having to fly in highly defended areas, literally places where a jet was just shot down by SAM or AAA, and it's likely going to still be active, and they got to get that airman out safe. We haven't had to contend with that level of threat in many years.
Yeah, it's interesting. Vietnam, it is hard to use the Vietnam lessons learned, and it seems like it's hard to use them uniquely. And I think all military lessons learned through time and history have a lot of way to reflect. What I'm reading right now for combat rescue more than anything else is actually World War II books and personal recovery during World War II because of the geographical similarities with it compared to Vietnam. Our airmen don't relate to Vietnam very well. It's so far away from them now. I mean, even the Gulf War is a long way from them now. Most of our airmen weren't alive in the Gulf War, so it's hard for them to connect to it very well. But I can understand when you look at that set, you look at North Vietnam, you look at all these missile engagement zones, and you start looking at a picture of the Pacific Theater, they are very similar, but warfare has changed so much. There's a picture I can't stand. It'll show a picture of our Combat Search and Rescue Task Force now and in Vietnam and say, look, it hasn't changed. It's changed tremendously. When I do combat search and rescue mission training now with A10s and everybody else, we'll do whole missions where we never talk on our radio. It's all digital integration, satellite over the horizon movement of isolated survivor radios and those type of things. It has changed tremendously. It just so happens we're still in aircraft and helicopters, but the way we do the mission has just changed tremendously. But I think when you look at the isolated personnel side in Vietnam and how we use safe zones and bailout areas, I think there are some lessons there that we have lost working against a VEO where we didn't think we'd have a lot of evasion capability. We didn't think we'd have an enemy that would recognize the Geneva Convention with how they handled them afterwards. I think there's some lessons with the isolated personnel that are extremely valuable to us and that we can build on.
Yeah, and again, you and I are the same age group. I was in IFF during 9/11, and I know my personal experience was taking every lesson learned from the Hanoi Hilton from a CSAR perspective. We had O'Grady as an example of things to do and not to do. And then, of course, General Goldfein's shoot down. And I was a triple nickel guy, so I went right into all of that. And then you're right. It seems like the aircrew training perspective really seemed to shift away as we got into Iraq and Afghanistan. So going back to aircrew training, I know, I guess Vietnam was the focal point. I agree that there's maybe a mismanaged case study in many ways, but from an aircrew training perspective, like you mentioned, do you think we need to kind of change or ramp up or refocus this escaping and evading in lessons learned from your team?
We do, especially when you look at the Pacific, where the area of operations is just so large. The idea of recovery happening within the first 24 hours is highly dependent on where the incident happens at. But the odds are for most of the recoveries, they're not happening in the first 24 hours. When you go back to when I was talking about Afghanistan, I told you that I was focused on recovering someone within the first hour. That's the big difference. And we were in Afghanistan, Iraq, we were training some very advanced techniques for that first hour and how do you evade as best you can, with an expectation on the other side that if you didn't evade successfully, it would probably be the end of your life. Now with this is different. And I don't know that we are able to get back to that. It took us a long time to get out of Vietnam tactics and Afghanistan and Iraq. Now we have to figure out how to get back to that. I do know that our survival, evasion, resistance, and escape teams are thinking through those problem sets. And then we have two adversaries that we don't know how they're going to react to those types of things. But what we do know in theater is we have partners. So in Afghanistan or Iraq, it was a 1 or 0. They were either your partner or you were a hostage. That was it. You didn't have any other options. Now in the Pacific, it's, what's a fishing boat going to do if they pick me up in the middle of the water? What is a non-allied nation, but a neutral nation? How are they going to react? And that's some stuff that I think we have to bring into training a little better with our folks. And it's a more complex piece. And then the other side of that, and what we didn't necessarily have in Vietnam, is how to use technology to help that soldier, sailor, airman, marine on the ground get recovered, whether it's via integrating into a cellular network that's already there. I mean, we've worked through some of those pieces, but we probably have to normalize them across the force, the joint force better.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And for those that are unfamiliar with what Colonel Cook's talking about with the golden hour, inside combat rescue is probably the best way to really understand the mission that you've been doing for the last 20 years. I think it's a Nat Geo special, so if folks want to Google and find out where they can watch that, I think it'd be really, really helpful for those that want to know more about the CSAR mission. But I want to transition a little bit here. As I understand you guys are, and you mentioned you're in the middle of getting a new helicopter, the H860 Whiskey. What are the advantages of this new model?
The number one, and this is not the most interesting advantage. Number one is my mission capable rate just went up because I have a new helicopter that's not been beat up for 20 years of combat. And that's probably not the most interesting thing to get out of a new aircraft, but when you're talking about having to move to austere locations and move around theater, not having a huge supply and sustainment chain for an old aging helicopter is pretty critical. The helicopter itself, if you looked at it, if the average person looked at the H860G and the H860 Whiskey, they would go, same helicopter. That's an airframe approach to it. What's different is what's on the inside, and it's the digital integration and how the digital feeds. And all of our combat experiences now are very different in a digital networked integrated environment. I talked about how we don't really have to communicate via voice anymore. Everything's via data link. And how do I talk to other air players in the air? That aircraft, and it'll be combat ready at the end of this year, and we're going through the testing right now of it. It's not fully up yet, but it looks like we're on glide path to be combat ready as when we expect it to be in October of 22 and ready to deploy. That aircraft will be able to sense anything that's putting out a mission, such as a radar mission, better than any other asset that's not specifically a surveillance asset, because it has to be able to look at high altitude threats and low altitude threats. It can receive all those emissions and put them out in the data link right away and let our partners know what's targeting us and what's out there. And it puts it on the network, and it's a sensor in a very unique way. The other thing it allows us to do is integrate with survivor systems very simply. So as opposed to the past where it was always a shell game of trying to get all these Frankenstein systems in the G model that we just added on over time. With the Whiskey, it's really a plug and play. I plug in my card, I turn the jet on, and it works. And I get all the information I need automatically without a person in a loop, and I can kick information out automatically without a person in a loop. And then some other defensive components on this aircraft are already better than what we saw in the G, and integration of mission systems, such as the FLIR. We now have a more capable FLIR. Our old FLIR was more of a, you could see if there's a mountain in front of you type of FLIR. And now I have about an 8-mile look where I can pick out a person from about 8 miles away through my sensor. So a lot of improved avionics in the system.
Yeah, it sounds like a quantum leap for you all, and hopefully take some task workload off of you so you can focus on the mission. But what about the health of the rest of the assets that support you? Will we need to see any evolution there and think about how they can be upgraded, or really the health of everything to make sure that we can rescue a downed personnel and get out safe?
Yeah, I'd say across the board, combat search and rescue has to be integrated better in the combat air forces. And so we talked about the Sandy and how successful they are at combat rescue. And an aircraft has some reasons what makes it very successful. It's long loader times, it's heavy weapons, its ability to be flying at lower altitudes and still defend itself in the titanium bathtub. Those things all make it very successful in the combat rescue mission, but it's not everywhere. And so I need more assets. I don't have a number 2 asset. So the A10 Sandy pilot's number 1, there's no number 2. I need number 2. I need F-35 pilots who understand how to locate their wingman and help support and recover their wingman through integration. We have to get Air Force-wide better at combat rescue. Our command and control elements need more repetitions on how to do combat rescue. I don't know if there's a more difficult mission set than combat rescue. If you think that dynamic targeting, that is hitting a target that pops up suddenly on you, is one of the most difficult mission sets, okay, now make that where instead of putting a bomb on a person's head, I have to deliver a 130-knot helicopter to that person, locate them, get them on the helicopter, and get them back out, and how much time that takes. So it's like a dynamic targeting mission set that's already difficult, and it's just been exponentially harder with what the weapon is, which is actually recovery. So in order to be successful in a mission that difficult, you have to have reps, you have to have training, and we're going to have to get better at that. One of the ways we're going to have to get better at that is through simulators. We've long looked at simulators as how you work at basic training, your initial fundamentals with aircraft. It's still good there, but what we need is more networked training with rescue aircraft. And with H860 Whiskey, one of the other advantages we have with it is we have simulators in the units with that aircraft. And by the end of the year, we'll get them on the network. And getting them training with the combat forces on the network out in the actual areas of operations we think that will fly, I think will help get us the repetitions that we need so that there's broader understanding of the combat search and rescue mission outside of the dedicated community that supports it.
Yeah, and it was a great highlight on just how tough it is to execute. You know, like I said, having done the Sandy thing in a Viper, or even just training to it as a seed guy, and they go, "Oh, you guys are first in, last out, but now we got to get our person off the range." And when you're pulling a whole lot of G's just to try to sawtooth around you guys and just be on station that long, it's a lot. There's so much going on, and at any moment you could find yourself back into another CSAR and starting all over. God forbid it evolves that way. Yeah, I apologize for getting reminiscent there, but you're definitely putting me back in the cockpit thinking about this. But I do want to go off of one thing that you mentioned, being over in the Indo-Pacific region, and frankly, it's a lot of water. And you mentioned integrating with the other services. So how do you see the airmen and capabilities working with Navy rescue capacities to retrieve downed aircrews?
Yeah, really all the joint assets. There isn't an asset or a partner nation that doesn't have a capability that wouldn't be valued for combat search and rescue. And like I said earlier, an allied fishing boat, if I put a Guardian Angel team or just a 3-person Guardian Angel team on an allied fishing boat, I just created a combat rescue capability with that fishing boat. They understand the mission, they can get the tasking, they can get to the location, and they can provide support once they get there. Certainly true with all of our Navy assets too. They're a little easier to integrate with. They don't have the long range capability for the recovery vehicles, but they certainly are highly capable with Navy swimmers and other folks. Our Army assets as well, they have some capability. They actually have H860s, which is very similar to ours. They looked at a lot of the capability that we have. They created teams to conduct personal recovery, and a lot of that's because of our integration in Afghanistan with them over the last 20 years. So our joint partners have some capabilities. That long range highly contested capability that's just kind of uniquely with dedicated CSAR assets and special operations forces who have their own mission set that they have to do. But that integration is pretty key and critical to include. I talked about I was reading World War II books to understand personal recovery. We have a former president who was rescued by a submarine. So what are other assets, non-traditional recovery assets that we can use, and what are some non-traditional capabilities we can use in our partners? I think that's going to open up that large area of operations in a lot of ways and let us just focus our dedicated assets in the high-risk areas.
Awesome. Well, sir, as the Air Force pivots towards peer competition with concepts like Agile Combat Employment or ACE and the lead wing, what can the service learn from the combat rescue community on how they'll fit into these new concepts?
Yeah, we talked about 20 years of combat experience, and when we look at why we came up with Agile Combat Employment, one of our biggest concerns was we've gotten used to flying from big airfields that have been there forever, that are very established, and we want to be able to operate from less established airfields locations. Combat Rescue's been doing that for the last 20 years. They've been out in the field. They've been as far forward as they can be, operating from anywhere so they need to. And then the other element of that is this idea of multi-capable airmen that can do skill sets outside of their normal duty codes to help enable the mission. In Combat Rescue, the community I grew up with, when you're a special mission aviator, your back-ender who normally works the gun on the aircraft, when we landed at a new site, they were the first ones to set up my satellite communication antenna. They had a side job as a comm support personnel. They understand that very well. It's part of their culture. And I think we can learn from the combat rescue community as we look to how do we operate austere environments? How do we have multi-capable airmen? How do we develop that into our culture? Because they've been doing it. They've been doing tactical command and control of their own forces. They've been doing operating from foreign locations, been doing how do I use what I've got in a resource neutral environment to still get the mission done. And that mindset's going to play very well of the 5 lead wings in Air Combat Command. 2 of them, Moody Air Force Base and Davis-Monthan, have rescue personnel. And 23rd Wing at Moody Air Force Base, my wing will be the first ones up on the hook in October for lead wing. And our rescue personnel have been absolutely critical for helping us be the breaching force that comes through in this new combat capability and start moving us along the way.
Yeah, and you mentioned culture, and again, I said earlier, I was lucky enough to be a brand new one-striper stationed up in Iceland, working with the rescue wing there, and then my second assignment was at Moody, when we had the composite wing, so I'm well-versed in understanding the connectivity of your culture in the CSAR world, and it's absolutely incredible, and it has such a rich history, thinking back to Colonel John Allison and Colonel Phil Cochran, who pioneered rescue with the first combat deployment of helicopters in Burma during World War II, as you mentioned, the Jolly Greens in Vietnam, and everything we've heard you discuss up to this point. As I understand, the A10, you have an A10 pilot in the 303rd Fighter Squadron, Lieutenant Colonel Mike Hickert, who won the DFC, or Distinguished Flying Cross, last November for what was labeled, quote, one of the most intense combat rescue missions of the Afghanistan war. And how does this heritage tie into the fabric of your culture?
Yeah, the heart of that heritage and what makes it so rich is that the mission is inherently righteous. At the end of the day, you're bringing people home to their families, and everybody identifies that. There's never a question of why we're doing something or any of the confusion that often happens in combat regarding the why. The why is always clear. And from that, you get these communities who are just 100% laser focused on what they do and getting it done. And that heritage kind of carries through, and you feel part of this long chain of airmen who have always been focused on bringing people home to their families. And once you get in that community and you get a chance to see it, it's in you. It's in your blood, and you can't get it out. And that's what we get with these rescue airmen, and that's what makes them so effective.
Awesome. Well, I know we are getting tight on time, but I'd like to offer you the opportunity for any final thoughts that we should consider with CSAR.
No, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about combat search and rescue. It's my passion, along with quite a few other airmen around here who are very passionate about what we do and why we do it. So thank you for having the interest in it, and appreciate the time.
Well, sir, I really appreciate your time today. What you and your fellow airmen do is incredible, and as someone who's flown in combat, I'd like to offer an incredibly sincere, personal thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, our listeners, for your continued support, and thank you for tuning in today. We've got a lot of new and exciting content coming your way, and this year, we're headed out to air and space events near you, so don't forget to follow or subscribe to the podcast, Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn to find out where we'll be and what the Mitchell team has in our site picture. And please, don't forget to leave us a rating. Hit the like button and follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. Also, leave us a comment to let us know what you think about our podcast and let us know areas you think we should explore further. Please visit us at mitchellaerospacepower.org to read the latest reports, events, and analysis that are charting the vectors for our air and space forces. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Stay safe and check 6.